parashahs 3 and 4, Melchizedek and the Covenant. Last week, we concluded our consideration of the early period of Avraham moving through the land of Canaan and his sojourn into Egypt because of the famine. Upon his return from the land returning to the land of Canaan, Avram, Lot parted company. Lot settled into the Arava, while Avram took the high country, the Canaanite territory, as Bereshit chapter 13 concludes. Today we're starting in chapter 14, which opens with reference to the 4 kings from the region around the Euphrates River, who were making war with the 5 kings who'd occupied the plains of the Arava, which Sodom, of course, was mentioned as the main city of that region. In verse 4, we're told that the 5 kings of the Arava had been vassal nations, or vassal groups of the king, Kedorlaomer, the leader of the 4 northern kingdom confederacy. However, in the 13th year of their servitude, the 5 kings of the Arava rebelled against their overlord. Then in the 14th year, Kedorlaomer, supported by the 3 other northern kings, confronted the 5 kings of the south in the Siddim Valley, which is in the northern end of the Arava. Finally, Kedorlaomer withdrew, and in verses 12 through 13 says, as they left, they took Lot, Avram's brother's son, and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. However, some had escaped and came and told Avram, the Hebrew, who was living in the oaks of Mamre. Now, in response, in verses 14 through 17, when Avram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he took trained men, 318 of them, and went in pursuit of the others to Dan. During the night, he and his servants divided his forces against them, and then attacked and pursued them as far away as Damascus in the north. He recovered all the goods and brought back Lot his nephew, together with the women and other people. After his return from slaughtering Kedorlaomer, the king and the kings with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet Avram in the Shivar Valley, which is known as the King's Valley. Avram, with just 318 servants, vanquished the armies of Kedorlaomer and the other kings with him. Avram took back Lot and the people who had been taken hostage, along with the goods that were stolen. When Avram returned, he was met by the king of Sodom in the King's Valley, somewhere in the Avar region. At the same time, Avram was also meeting the king of Sodom in verses 18 through 24. Another unknown king, Melchizedek, king of Salem, presented himself to Avram with bread and wine as a blessing. Verse 18 describes Melchizedek with the words, he was a Cohen of El Elyon, God Most High. Then Melchizedek blessed Avram with the profoundly significant words, blessed be Avram by El Elyon, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be El Elyon, who has handed over your enemies to you. In response, Avram gave him 1/10 of everything. There has been considerable discussion in religious circles about the personage of this mysterious character, Melchizedek. Some have suggested that he was a human king of an unknown city called Shalem, suggesting that the city may have later become known as Jerusalem. However, at the time of that encounter, Jerusalem was an insignificant Canaanite city. Others have suggested the mysterious character was Shem, the first son of Noah, and an antecedent of Avram. So who really was Melchizedek? There are only 2 references to him in the whole of the Tanakh, Firstly, in Bereshit 14, verse 18, which we've just considered, and the other is in Psalm 110, verse 4, where David the psalmist is speaking of him in a way that relates to other passages about Yeshua, as we find in the Brit Hadashah. And if we turn to the book of Hebrews, chapters 5 through 7, as we read, there are 10 references there to Melchizedek, and all of which build upon Psalm 110 and 111. So when the narrative of Hebrews is considered alongside what took place during the encounter between Melchizedek and Avram, we see that everything points forward to Melchizedek being an early manifestation of Yeshua as both king and priest of El Elyon, God Most High. However, Yeshua, when he appeared to Avram, only ever appeared as El Shaddai. He was not known as Yahweh until Moshe had his encounter with God at the burning bush 7 generations later. So returning to Bereshit, Avram appears to have been aware that he was being confronted by a unique character, unlike anyone he had ever encountered before. The circumstances were themselves unique because Avram had just overpowered 4 strong kings with a small number of household servants. Then upon his return, he was confronted by someone who appeared unannounced and blessed him with both an offering of bread and wine. The offering of bread and wine has never been previously mentioned in Bereshit and is not known in any historical records of any such a ritual being a custom among the ancient Bronze Age people groups. The only previous reference to wine is when Noah got drunk from the produce of his own viticultural efforts following the flood. Yet even that situation has no suggestion of a ritual blessing. Another important feature about Melchizedek, it said to Avram, he is bestowing a blessing upon him. That blessing was not only upon Avram, but it was also directed towards El Elyon, God Most High himself. It must also be considered that all that appeared to have taken place in the presence of the king of Sodom, because in verse 7 we're told the king of Sodom went out to meet Avram, which suggests that he was there while the blessing from Melchizedek was taking place. That line of reasoning is further supported by verses 21 through 24, where the king of Sodom immediately asked Avram to give him the people that Avram had brought back from the war. The king then offered Avram all the spoils of war as his reward, but Avram refused. And there's a double significance in what he says, that under no circumstances would he allow a detestable king to make him rich. But there appears to be another second unstated reason why Avram's refusal occurred, which I suggest relates to what transpired with Melchizedek. Being fully aware that there had been divine intervention in the conquest of the 4 kings, Avram knew that he could not accept a large payment for what had happened. Having just given 10% of the booty to Melchizedek, Avram acknowledged that it was because of the divine intervention that the war was won. That line of reasoning is further supported in verse 24, when he says, I will take only what my troops have eaten, and their share of the spoil belongs to the men who came with me. But that is all I will take. So moving on to chapter 15, the focus of the narrative changes and jumps forward in time, where in verses 1 through 3 there appears to be yet another discourse between Avram and El Elyon, who throughout the dealings with Avram, as is known to Avraham and to the people around him as El Shaddai, who again reminds Avram that he is his protector. The statement possibly relates back to when the divine intervention enabled Avram to vanquish those 4 kings. However, by that later stage, Avram was about 85 years old, and he appears to have been reflecting back on the fact that he had no children who would take his possessions when he died. He realized that he may have to leave everything to his loyal servant Eliezer from Damascus. Next, Avram openly expresses his concern by saying to El Shaddai, "You haven't given me a child." In verse 4, El Shaddai responds by telling him that he would have a child from his own body, and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. The one who spoke to Avram on that occasion was said to be the word of Yahweh, whom we now know, of course, is Yeshua. But whether Yeshua appeared in person or spoke as a voice from heaven in vision to Avram, it is not stated. But it was quite clear, there is no doubt that you will have a child. The rest of chapter 15 deals with the cutting of the covenant, where Avram was called upon to cut and lay the specified animals in 2 rows, ready for the cutting of the covenant. As the sun was setting, Avram fell into a deep sleep. Then, while asleep, El Shaddai spoke to him and foretold what was destined to occur in connection with his descendants. Through that dream, El Shaddai gave Avram a glimpse of what was destined to occur in relation to his family through Yaakov, who would be his grandson, through Sarah, his wife. As verse 13 through 16 say, El Shaddai said to Avram, "Know this for certain, your descendants will be foreigners in this land that is not theirs. They will be slaves and held in oppression there for 400 years. But I will also judge that nation, the one that makes them slaves. Afterwards they will leave with many possessions. As for you, you will join your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. Only in the 4th generation will your descendants come back here, because only then will the Amori be ripe for punishment." Now that promise became the embodiment of the covenant which was about to be cut. So in verses 18 through 21, El Shaddai defines for Avram the actual territory that was to be included in the promise by saying, "I have given this land to your descendants, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the territory of the Canaani, the Kenizi, the Kadami, the Hitti, the Perizzi, the Rephaim, the Amori, the Canaani, the Gehazi, and the Yevuzi, all 10 of them." Having reassured Avram about what was destined to occur in the future, and having defined the actual territory involved in El Shaddai then cut the covenant as a confirmation of that promise he had made. The 2 parties to the cutting of the covenant were the smoking firepot and the flaming torch, which passed between the animal parts, so that the eternal covenant over the land was duly cut. So who were the smoking firepot and the flaming torch who were involved in the cutting of that covenant? Now there have been many suggestions put forward by both Jewish and Christian scholars and commentators, but without any clear definition as an answer. However, when we consider the covenant embodied in that promise made to Avram and his descendants through all generations that would follow, it is clear that Avram could not be party to that covenant, as he could not ensure the conditions of the covenant were met through future generations. Hence, El Shaddai wanted the covenant to become an everlasting seal of the promise he'd made to Avram. He needed assurance that the promise would remain eternal. Therefore, The covenantal partner had to be someone like himself who would be around for many generations. Further, because Yahweh God claimed eternal rights of ownership to that small piece of territory, it meant that the only other being who could in the future contest his ownership would be Satan, the adversary. Therefore, I suggest that the only other party who could challenge the promises made by El Shaddai had to be the other party of that covenant. Only by being a party to the covenant could El Shaddai ensure that the adversary, at any time in the future, if he challenged that covenant of promise, the penalty would be such as the violation of such a covenant would be certain death for the guilty party. That is the reason why the animals were cut in portions and were used for the cutting of the covenant as a symbol, so that what would occur if either party broke the terms of the covenant. Now, in the 21st century, we are personally witnessing a direct violation of that eternal covenant, which is being led by the adversary with his call for a non-people group called the Palestinians to be given the full territorial rights as defined by the worldwide chant from the river to the sea. So the question must be asked, why now? As the original covenant appears to have been made between El Shaddai, whom we now know as Yeshua, and Satan the adversary, it is fitting that Israel, now re-established in the disputed territory and the nearness of Yeshua's return, that dispute over the occupation of Eretz-Yisra'el would once again come to a head. Because the adversary knows that he can't overpower El Elyon, God Most High, he will do his utmost to destroy God's chosen people, Israel. But, as we know from Revelation chapter 20, it is only a matter of time before Satan will be chained and imprisoned for 1,000 years during the reign of Yeshua. Therefore, the adversary is going all out to overcome the original covenant he cut with Yeshua before he's imprisoned and ultimately, of course, removed from the universe. That is why the adversary is gathering all the nations of the world to try and force the people of Israel off their land into the Mediterranean Sea. No other piece of territory has ever been so coveted as that small portion that El Shaddai promised to Abraham so long ago. So moving on to chapter 16, we find that having received the promise, Avram still had no heir. So Sarai tried to help by offering Hagar, her maidservant, to bear a son for Avram, because at that stage Avram had been in the land for 10 years and he was 85 years old. Even he was beginning to doubt the words of El Shaddai, that he had spoken earlier. The outcome was the birth of Ishmael. But, as we know, that was not in keeping with the earlier promise made by El Shaddai. The promise was to be fulfilled through a child born through his own wife Sarai, not through the son of a maidservant. However, when Avram was 99 years old, El Shaddai appeared yet again in chapter 17 verse 1, saying, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Walk in my presence and be pure-hearted. I will make a covenant between me and you will increase your numbers greatly. Also, El Shaddai said in verses 5 and 6, Your name will no longer be Avram, exalted father, but your name will become Avraham, father of many, because I have made you the father of many nations. I will cause you to be very fruitful. I will make nations of you. Kings will descend from you, and you will be the father of many nations. Later, In verses 15 and 16, El Shaddai says to Avram, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai, mockery. Her name is to be Sarah, princess. I will bless her. Moreover, I will give you a son through her. Truly, I will bless her. She will be the mother of nations, and kings of peoples will come from her." Having changed their names, El Shaddai again confirms his earlier promise by saying in verses 7 through 8, "I am establishing my covenant between me and you, along with your descendants after you, generation after generation, as an everlasting covenant, to be God for you and your descendants after you. I will give you and your descendants after you the land, all the land of the Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God." So we can see through all that occurred that El Shaddai had been patiently waiting to see if Abraham would react, how he would react to all that had transpired. By holding back from revealing all the details, El Shaddai was testing the faithfulness of Abraham before paving the way for his promise to take effect. Finally, El Shaddai says in 17 verse 10, "Here is my covenant, which you are to keep between me and you, along with all your descendants after you. Every male among you is to be circumcised." Unlike the actual cutting of the covenant, in which Avram had no direct part, El Shaddai is now binding Abraham into that covenant through the act of circumcision. The sign of the covenant was to be performed on the 8th day of a boy's life, and it was to apply to all males in the household of Avram, including the slaves born in the house and those bought from foreigners. El Shaddai then concluded his discourse by saying in verse 14, "Any uncircumcised male, not allowing himself to be circumcised in the flesh, that person will be cut off from his people, because he has broken my covenant." However, even though he had acknowledged the covenant El Shaddai made with him, Avram still doubted his ability to father a second child at nearly 100 years old, and particularly through his wife Sarah, who at that stage was 90 years old and still barren. Sarah, to be able to conceive at 90 sounded ridiculous to both. But El Shaddai persisted by saying in 17 verse 19, "Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you will call him Yitzhak," laughter. "I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and descendants after him." While having established that yet another child was to be born and would provide the lineage for fulfillment of the covenant, El Shaddai did recognize Avram's love for his firstborn Ishmael by ensuring that his descendants would have a place in the future development, as El Shaddai says in verses 20 to 22. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you, I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful and give him many descendants. He will be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Yitzhak, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year." With that, El Shaddai finished speaking with Abraham and went up from him. At that point, chapter 17 concludes with Abraham circumcising all his males in his household, starting with Ishmael and himself. That has been a complex journey through the time when Avram returned from Egypt, so let's recap briefly. Firstly, Avram was blessed by Melchizedek and gave over 10% of the spoils of war. Yahweh was speaking to Avraham and made himself known to him as El Shaddai, as he did not make himself known to anyone as Yahweh until he had the encounter with Moshe at the burning bush. Avram and Sarai are promised their child will be the descendant, and their descendants will inherit Eretz-Yisra'el. El Shaddai puts a stamp on Eretz-Yisra'el as the territory forever. And the cutting of the covenant with the adversary was the seal that the land promised to Abraham and his descendants would remain forever. El Shaddai also renamed Avram and Sarai by calling them Avraham and Sarah, and reaffirmed his earlier promise that they would inherit his land. El Shaddai also told Abraham that his descendants would be forced to sojourn in Egypt, that he would bring them back to Eretz-Yisra'el at the rightful time, and they would inherit it. El Shaddai also recognized Abraham's love for Ishmael and promised that he too would become the father of 12 people groups. El Shaddai finally bound Abraham into the eternal land covenant by requiring him to circumcise himself and all the males in his household, with the command that all subsequent generations that were born into Abraham's family would have to be circumcised on the 8th day of their life. So having considered all those events, we can now move into this week's parashah, which is only going to be a short portion, which first deals with the destruction of Sodom and the 4 cities of the Arava. The whole saga relating to the destruction of Sodom and the sparing of the life of Lot and his 2 daughters is covered in Bereshit chapters 18 and 19, and the saga ends with Lot becoming the father of 2 people groups, Moab and Ammon. Now I want to leap over chapters 18 through 20 and pick up the threads of the family development that centered on Ishmael and Yitzhak, along with Lot as part of the extended family. The reason for jumping forward is that to maintain the flow of the family development, which was to extend through Israel as the nation alongside of Moab and Ammon, who both stood against their cousin Israel at every stage in history. Even today, in the 21st century, there is still deep animosity between the modern state of Israel and their neighbors across the Yarden River. The Kingdom of Jordan is the modern entity that resulted of the carve-up of the Arab territories by the British and French forces following the end of World War I. The Kingdom of Jordan comprises 3 main people groups, including the descendants of Moab and Ammon, alongside the descendants of Esau, who, of course, was the twin brother of Yaakov, the 3rd patriarch of Israel. So we see the events surrounding the destruction of Sodom and the formation of the modern Kingdom of Jordan are significant in the overall development of history, particularly as it relates to Eretz-Yisra'el and the present situation the state of Israel is facing at this present time. So returning to today's parashah, I want to pick up the narrative in chapter 21 because it speaks of the birth and the early development of Yitzhak, about whom El Shaddai spoke in chapter 17, verse 19, when he said that Sarah would bear Avram a child. In the first 21 verses of chapter 21, we delve into the details about the relationship between Sarah and Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, and the friction that developed as Ishmael began to make fun of Yitzhak. The outcome of that struggle was that Hagar and Ishmael were sent away from the family camp. Hence, from the very early stages, the animosity that developed between Ishmael and Yitzhak passed down through all the descendant people groups. The narrative about the 2 boys then concludes in verses 20 and 21 by saying, God was with Ishmael and he grew. He lived in the desert and became an archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother chose for him a wife from the land of Egypt. The remaining verses of chapter 21 address yet another subject that links back as a continuation of events spoken about in chapter 20. In those two portions, we read about Avram moving his family southward to the Negev soon after Sodom had been destroyed. Together in chapter 20 and the latter part of chapter 21, it deals with Avram's encounter with Abimelech, king of Gerar, which we now know as being Gaza. So, I will return to consider those portions next Shabbat, because they have a direct connection with the current Gaza crisis. Then we will also consider in chapter 22 next week what leads on from Abraham's encounter with Abimelech, with El Shaddai calling Avram to sacrifice his son Yitzhak on Mount Moriah. So in conclusion, we have seen just how important it is to reflect on the family dynamics and development that occurred in the time of Abraham and Sarah, because all that occurred at that stage set in motion the struggles of modern Israel. And what they are now facing is a result of the hands of Satan, the adversary, who knowingly violated the covenant made over the territory of Eretz-Yisra'el. We have also seen how the family dynamics and the actions of the descendants of Ishmael, Moab, Ammon, Esau are now collectively working in conjunction with many nations from the Western world to bring an end to the sovereignty of modernist state of Israel. Only by digging deeply into those dynamic developments of the people of Bereshit do we truly understand the full significance of the current Middle Eastern crisis. So next Shabbat, God willing, we will consider Avram's encounter with Abimelech, which again became the origin of the current crisis in Gaza, and how the adversary has remained a stumbling block for both Israel and the rest of the world, and will remain so until he is finally chained for 1,000 years. Until then, the situation will not change. So until the next time we meet, Shabbat Shalom.